Today, we're gonna do a passage, a chapter in the Bible, John chapter 11, which is a very powerful passage. And in this, we're going to be talking about death, resurrection, and life. So, light subjects. I want to begin, though, by telling you a little story. This is something that happened to me a number of years ago. I was working with a man who had two wives. So let me explain what happened. He fell in love. He got married. He married this woman, and they were married for a number of years. And then I guess they fell out of love, or something happened, and they ended up getting divorced. Okay, it happens. Then a while after that, he got married to another woman, and they were together for a while, and then they, I guess, decided they weren't in love anymore. But rather than divorce her, he bought her a place in Florida and sent her off to Florida. So she was still his wife in Florida. Well, after she moved out and went to Florida, the ex-wife moved back into the house with the man. So you have ex-wife living in the house with the man, and you have present wife living in Florida in her own place. Well, they had their strange way of balancing all this out, and then he had the gall to go and die. That created some problems. The first thing that happened was I got a call from the lady, the ex-wife, who says, "You got to help me stay in this place." And then I got a call from the wife in Florida saying, "You got to help me get her out of the place." And, I'm just kind of thinking, no, I got to stay out of this mess right here. But that's not the end of the story, because you see, this guy had a prepaid cemetery plot for himself and his wife. And so in the settlement of all these litigation things that were going on, one of the major issues was which wife gets the prepaid plot. So is it the wife that he had when he paid for the plot, or is it the wife he had when he died? Which one? And they were fighting over this, and they finally resolved the issue by digging the hole deeper and putting one on top of the other. So death can create some strange situations that we all have to deal with. So what I wanted to do, though, is begin by just kind of defining death as we look at this. And so here we are. It's an irreversible cessation of all vital functions, especially as indicated by permanent stoppage of the heart, respiration, and brain activity. Yeah, we think we all know what death is anyway. So what's interesting, though, about this is death is, in the Bible it talks about this, death is the greatest enemy of all, right? It's final. There's no undoing it once it's done. There are no second chances. Sometimes it comes very slowly over a period of years. Sometimes it happens in a moment. It's the enemy each of us faces at some point in time. And for those of us who are left behind, it creates grief and loss and pain. We'll never have another opportunity physically here on this earth to be able to talk with that person, hug that person, share experiences with that person. And I'm sure you've had experiences where you wish that you could share something with someone who is gone now, and you can't. But as astounding as it seems, God gives us hope in life beyond this physical body. So death is just that transformation. And we know even the Old Testament, a lot of people don't know this, but the Old Testament talks about resurrection. Look at this. In Daniel 12:2, it says that multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. And then in Isaiah 26:19, Isaiah says, "But your dead will live, Lord, their bodies will rise. Let those who dwell in the dust wake up and shout for joy. Your dew is like the dew of the morning. The earth will give birth to her dead." So there's hope that's given. Now, quite frankly, this was one of the things that caused a rift between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, because the Sadducees only believed in the first 5 books of the Bible as scripture, and we don't have any passages talking about the resurrection in the first 5 books of the Bible. It comes later on in the prophets and other places, in the Psalms. And so the Sadducees, they said, no, there is no resurrection of the dead. We don't see that in the Torah. And that's why they call them sad, you see. But what happens, though, is the Pharisees believed in the entire Old Testament, what's the equivalent of our 39 books of the Old Testament. They saw all of that as scripture. So there are passages in there that talk about resurrection. So they believed in a general resurrection. They had that framework as they were walking through their lives. And then as we look at Jesus, he also speaks about resurrection. And as Jesus is meeting with his disciples, this is earlier than the passage we're going to read later, he says, "Do not be amazed at this, for the time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done what is good will rise to live, and those who have done what is evil will rise to be condemned." So this is kind of like the Daniel passage. It's reminiscent of what Daniel 12 talks about. There's kind of 2 states, right? And depending on the life you live, the commitments you make. But death isn't the end. There's something more than that. Now here, in the passage we just looked at, Jesus talks about resurrection. In John 11, he demonstrates it. So let's look at where we're talking about. We're talking about a map right here, looking at a map, and you can see that it says that Jesus was across the Jordan at the end of chapter 10. And so that puts him over in the Perea area. Most people, we know Lazarus, who's the subject of our passage, is going to be in Bethany. And that's probably at least 20 miles different, at least a day's walk from one place to the next. And so you can see it here. We also know that this is taking place, it looks like, close to Passover. At the end of chapter 11, it says it was right next to Passover. So a big feast is about ready to come. And so anyway, we've got the difference between where Jesus was on the east side of the Jordan River and where Lazarus and Martha and Mary are on the west side. So as we look at the story, it begins like this. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sister sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." Now, I have the word love underlined right here. That's the word that comes from phileo, the friendship kind of love. So they're recognizing this is a friend. There's a special relationship right here. And it's kind of interesting that Lazarus, Mary, and Martha are named because most of the miracles, the people that are healed and brought, things happen to them, they aren't mentioned by name. We don't see their names. But these 3 are special to Jesus. They have that friendship, that closeness. It's not just somebody coming up to Jesus, but somebody close. So she sends word to Jesus that this is happening. And by the way, John right here references Mary putting the perfume on Jesus, but that doesn't happen in John until chapter 12. So obviously John understands that the people already know about this incident. Mary putting the perfume on Jesus, because probably from one of the other Gospels or some other source, because he just references it like everybody knows this. Martha and Mary realize death is imminent as they send their message to Jesus. We assume that Jesus was probably young like Jesus, Lazarus was young like Jesus, and probably, this was very unexpected, this thing that's happening to Lazarus. He got sick and he's dying and he's deteriorating quickly, and this is unexpected, and Martha and Mary are worried, they're concerned, they're probably panicked because of they don't know what to do. And I know what that's like to some degree. Many of you know my story. I I was married before Sharon, and I was 24 years old, about a year and 3 months into my marriage, when my wife got up in the middle of the night and walked down the hall and then collapsed. And when she did, I ran to her, and I tried to revive her. I tried to force her breathing. I could see that she was struggling to breathe, and I was trying to force her breathing. And I called the rescue squad as soon as I realized I can't do anything about this. And there's this sense of panic that strickens you when something's happening and it's happening fast and there's nothing you can do about it and you're helpless. And I can see Martha and Mary being in that circumstance. You know, they don't know what to do. They can't help this. And so they send word as fast as they can to Jesus, although it still probably took a day for the word to get to Jesus at this point. So as we go on, we look at the story. He says, when he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, so when he heard Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. Now, I've got the word glory here. This is something that Jesus is saying, this is going to reveal the true brilliance of God. Something here is going to happen that's going to show people who the real God is and what the real God can do. This is going to demonstrate something they just don't see anywhere else. And sometimes, Jesus indicates the purpose for what's going on. Sometimes he says, the sun rises and the rain falls on the good and the bad, but other times he says it's for a specific purpose. Like in chapter 9 when Sean was talking about this is so that God's work may be displayed. The question then arises, in what ways will God's Son be glorified through this event? And it's kind of amazing to think about this whole thing, because what happens is, it says in the next passage here, the same passage but underlined, Jesus loved Martha and Mary. That love is the agape word. But my question is, as they're listening to this, they're hearing him say, I love them so much that I'm going to wait and let Lazarus die, right? Can you imagine the confusion, the disconnect in that kind of a statement? I'm going to purposefully wait and let the guy die, and then I'm going to step in. That just doesn't sound right. But of course, Jesus knew some things that we didn't, right? So Jesus had a connection with his family. There's some discussion then, we're going to skip the passage where they talk about, should we go back, shouldn't we go back, or anything like that. But after that, he says, after he had said this, he went on to tell him, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going to wake him up. Okay? Well, that's cool. Jesus uses the term fallen asleep. And you ask the question, why? And it's probably because of his perspective on death, right? Death is not the end. Death is like a sleep. You move into that situation, and then you move out of it. It's a temporary state of being, in a sense, because it's just going from one to the next. It doesn't end things. So Jesus didn't say initially he's dead. And so, as we look at this passage as it continues, his disciples write, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better. Jesus has been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. Now, it's kind of interesting because when we think about this, first of all, nobody told Jesus that Lazarus was asleep or dead, right? They said he was sick. And yet Jesus knows something has happened more serious. He's got access to some information that we don't, that maybe most of us don't have, right? Now, what's interesting, though, about this passage right here is that these people, the disciples, are looking at things physically, as if everything is in this physical world, which is quite natural. We're physical beings in a physical universe, and so when you hear the word sleep, you think of physical sleep. Jesus was constantly trying to remind people that you need to look at things spiritually in a different way. Remember his discussion with Nicodemus. How can you be born again? Jesus is reminding people and talking in spiritual terms. So, the next one, Jesus then told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Lazarus is dead. The irreversible cessation of life. And why is Jesus glad that he was not there to heal Lazarus? Because something bigger is coming. And, Lazarus is going to have been dead without any thought process that maybe he wasn't dead. He's dead. And Jesus is about to do something that's going to change the lives of these people. And how do you think Martha and Mary and Lazarus are going to grow from this experience, this raising of Lazarus? It's pretty amazing. Martha, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. So 4 days, of course, meant that he was dead. The Jews had this belief that the spirit hovered around for about 3 days, the body, and then was gone. There's no way you can revive somebody after 3 days. And so 4 days makes it impossible. And you think about the timing. If Lazarus had died right after the message was sent, it takes a day to get to Jesus. Jesus spent 2 days waiting, and then he spent a day to get there, so 4 days. So it sounds like Lazarus must have died pretty quickly after the message was sent. 2 miles from Jerusalem, that means many people could come. It was an easy walk back and forth. And Chrysostom in the 4th century said, Lazarus was a man of rank, as is plain from the number who came to comfort his sister. So we see that that's probably a logical explanation. There were many people that came, and Jerusalem would have been only 2 miles away. So, Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. If only you had been here. Again, I think back of when I was 24, and I called the rescue squad. And even though it was only a matter of minutes between when I called and when they got there, it's like eternity. When you're waiting and you don't know what to do, and you feel so helpless. So this here, you can imagine them saying, if you had come immediately, maybe it would have made a difference. If you had rushed and gotten on a horse or taken a chariot or something, maybe you could have saved him. But he waited, and he couldn't. Martha's response, of course, was very natural. She knew about how Jesus could heal the sick. What she didn't know was that Jesus could raise the dead. And, we have to ask ourselves that question. Are there times when maybe we feel like God has not answered our prayers or waited too long to answer our prayers, and we get kind of upset? And I'm wondering if sometimes maybe it's because we can't see the big picture. We can't see what God is about to do. All we can see is our little spectrum of focus right then. So Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Martha knew the teachings of the resurrection of the dead at the time of judgment from the Old Testament, but that gives little comfort in this particular time of grieving and immediate loss. Knowledge of the Bible verses alone in itself is not enough to take away the pain of death. Death hurts. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. I am the resurrection and the life. The resurrection. He says, he's not saying, I have the power to resurrect. He's not saying, I bring resurrection. He's saying, I am the resurrection. It seems like the resurrection runs through him, and we need to be connected to him. We need to be engulfed with him. We need to be wrapped up in him to have that power of resurrection that runs through us. And it's interesting that Paul even talks about a kind of a spiritual resurrection. You know, in 2 Corinthians 5, he talks about us being new creations. And there's something that changes when we commit our lives to God, and God resurrects a spirit within us just from that standpoint. But here in specifically, we're talking about a physical resurrection of these the people, right? Jesus talks about life. In the beginning of the gospel, he said, in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. In John chapter 5, he says, for as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. John 10:10, he says, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I see that as a life of purpose, of joy, of meaning. You know, I know what I'm here for, and I'm doing that work, and God's helping me to do that work. It's a life that isn't wasted, and this is a life that is filled with God's Spirit, an abundant life, a life that makes a difference in other people. Jesus asks, do you believe this? To Martha, and she replies, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. So, I'm not sure that's exactly what Jesus was asking. You know, Jesus asked her, do you believe? And even with the explanation, Martha hasn't quite understood what's going to happen here with the resurrection. She understands that those who commit to Jesus will avoid that second death that Revelation talks about. But really, that is enough. So maybe Martha's understanding wasn't perfect. You know, whose is? But that was enough for her to cling to Jesus and commit to Jesus. And you know, he continues to ask us each day, I think, do you believe this? Just as Jeff asked us this morning, do you believe this? None of us believes completely and perfectly, or we wouldn't sin. We wouldn't fall short. But God accepts us if we're moving in the right direction. We're making that commitment. We're repenting when we go astray. When we do fall short, God takes us. And so this is enough. Okay? After he'd said this, she went back, Martha, and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. And now Jesus had not entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. And then, when the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. The same question that Martha had. The same feeling that naturally comes from knowing that Jesus could have done something, and he waited to come. This doesn't make any sense, right? There is differences between the way Martha and Mary approach Jesus. You know, we often talk about their differences. Martha comes and she talks with Jesus. Mary falls at his feet. Mary's much more emotionally expressive, of course, than Martha. Martha's more duty-bound and the responsible person. Martha gets lost in the worship of God. But Martha and Mary made that same statement about, oh, if you'd only been here. So, as we look at this, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews, let's get this up. When Jesus saw her weeping, and when the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then Jesus said, "See how he loved him?" And some of them said, "Could not he have opened the eyes of the blind man who kept him from dying?" Jesus was deeply moved. Jesus wept. The people had all seen that Martha and Mary had, that Jesus had power over illness. But death? Here we are at an event common to all of us. Right? And when we lose the people we love, it's emotional. Jesus wept, of course, is known as the shortest verse in the King James Bible. But it tells us a lot about Jesus. Jesus knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. So the question is, well, why was he weeping? And I think some people put some fancy footwork on this, that, well, he was weeping because the people didn't understand and all that. I have a very simple process of thinking he was probably just emotionally involved with the people. I will tell you, I have probably watched It's a Wonderful Life between 50 and 60 times in my life. I tend to memorize movies that I like, so I can tell you every scene in that movie. I can tell you most of the dialogue in that movie. And when you get to the end of the movie, I can recite that dialogue line by line and tell you what cuts go to this scene and this scene and this scene. And yet every single time I watch that movie, I end up with tears coming down my face. So it's not a matter of being surprised by the ending. It's the emotion that just weaves through us and hits us. And I think Jesus was no exception. Jesus was someone who felt with the people. And here he is with his best friends, and they're struggling, and they're weeping, and so is he. So Jesus, once more, deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there's a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you, if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" We have resurrections in the Bible talked about with Elisha and Elijah, but people were just ill for a while, and they came back, not 4 days. Burials were quick in the ancient days. They had usually, they didn't embalm people except Joseph and Jacob, who were in Egypt. They just let their bodies deteriorate. Typically, they would, if they were wealthy enough, they would have this kind of a cave, and they'd have maybe several different flattened out slabs in the cave where they could put the body, wrap them up, let that body deteriorate for a year. And essentially all that would be left would be bones by the end of the year. And then they'd take those bones and put them in an ossuary box and keep them forever right there. And so, Martha may have been thinking that Jesus simply wanted to mourn the body, see the body, and mourn for him. But have you ever noticed the difference between a Christian funeral and a non-Christian funeral? Both, of course, focus on the past, but the Christian funeral focuses on the future and the life of this person that's deceased. We've just had a couple of funerals here at this church in the last few months, and we focus on the hope and the joy and the glory that's coming from the person who had united with Christ. And it's an important difference that comes with Jesus. So they took away the stone, and then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." Jesus prayed, of course, in a loud voice, so for the benefit of the people. Sometimes we pray privately, sometimes to help lead others. The entire event, though, was for the purpose of developing, creating belief. One interesting question is, why did Jesus need to call Lazarus by name instead of just saying, "Come out"? It's probably because there were a lot of other dead people. He didn't want everybody coming to life. The cool thing was, Lazarus did. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and cloth around the face. And Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." You know, death, Sheol, Hades, they're all pictured as kind of subterranean prisons. But Jesus opens the gate to that prison. It says in Revelation 1:18, Jesus says, "I hold the keys to death and to Hades." Can you imagine the excitement of this event? I remember that one movie plays the Hallelujah chorus as this event is taking place. And I think, yeah, that's it. You know, it's an emotional scene that would have just amazed the people. In fact, I can imagine the scene. You've got this crowd that's around. Jesus is there. They open up the tomb. Jesus calls for Lazarus to come out. And everybody's eyes that have been on Jesus, they all turn to that tomb. And they're waiting, not knowing what to expect. And then he comes out. Wow. So the interesting thing is the reaction to this. It says, "Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to Jesus to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him." Remember, this is only 2 miles away from Jerusalem, shortly before the Passover. So one activity was that there were some people that probably ran to Jerusalem to explain in great excitement what they had just witnessed, the raising of Lazarus. This is amazing. Can you believe this? And it's probably part of the reason that all the people gathered on the triumphal entry, you know, where the people gathered at the entrance and laid the palm leaves down and everything, because this story had spread to Jerusalem and the people were excited by it. They were enlivened by it. This is the Messiah. This guy does things nobody can do. This is absolutely amazing. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. "What are we accomplishing?" they asked. "Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go like this, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come take away our temple and our nation." So from that day, they plotted to take his life. The Pharisees wanted to stop Jesus, right? And so Jesus was proclaimed king. As we look at this and finish this up, Augustine said, "Among all the miracles done by the Lord, the resurrection of Jesus holds a prime place in preaching. But if we consider alternatively who did it, our duty to rejoice rather than to wonder. The man who raised him from the dead, who made humankind, is the only one of the Father by whom, as you know, all things were made. And all things were made by him. Why is anyone amazed that one is raised by him when so many are daily brought into the world by his power? It is the greater deed to create men and women than to raise them." So he's just saying, look at the miracles of the universe, of life. This is a small miracle next to all of that. So if we look at all of this, we see that the raising of Lazarus is something to bring belief to people, but it's also like a preview, a trailer, a movie trailer. You know, and we can see what happens here. Jesus is focusing on something that's going to affect us, and you can read more about this in 1 Thessalonians 4, where Paul talks about the coming of the Lord, 1 Corinthians 15, where he talks about the resurrected bodies, Revelation 21 and 22, where he talks about the home for the resurrected. This is tremendous stuff, and so this raising of Lazarus is really just a preview of these kinds of things. So what do we get out of this? When we look at the raising of Lazarus, I think there's 3 conclusions. First one, death cannot defeat us. Second, resurrection recreates us. And third, life abundantly fills us. The promises all flow from our commitment to join with Jesus, to be engulfed with Jesus, to take the hand of Jesus and follow him. And how can we not follow Jesus when we read all of this? Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Let him show you this truth.